Today's podcast, Megan 18, Regional Executive for the ARLA Propertymark regulatory body. What are you looking forward to about meeting Megan?
Oh, I'm really excited for this one. It's something that I've mentioned to you and Ian many times, that I wanted to get someone from ARLA on the podcast. I think legislation is a really big thing. There's been lots of changes over the years and they're still ongoing with potential changes to happen in the near future. So I think it'd be good to sort of go into detail of what's changed in the last 12 months and what to expect over the next 12 months, along with some other important stuff.
We've got the Renters Reform Bill being discussed in Parliament too. So that's going to be a huge change to our industry if that is successful or going through in the way that we feel it might happen. And that would abolish our Section 21 notice, which for those sort of non-agents is our basic notice that we can serve with no reason. Now, there's lots of reasons why people are concerned about that to go, and I think for me, we've already been there back in the 80s when we didn't have assured short-hold tenancies, and what happened is that people left their properties empty rather than put tenants in because they couldn't get them back.
Yeah, it would be good to see the opinion of the person who takes the opinions of other agents, because she works on our behalf to an extent, filtering what we think, what we like, what we don't like, and also lobbying the government on behalf of agents, landlords and tenants alike. So it'd be really interesting to see from the horse's mouth where they are with those situations.
Really looking forward to it. Let's do it. Let's bring it on.
Thanks for joining us on our podcast today. For those who don't know you and don't know what you do, give us a quick intro.
So I'm Megan. I'm the ARLA Regional Executive for Oxfordshire and Berkshire. So I work alongside Propertymark. So I feed in from our area, looking after all of our members in the region and sort of feed in from there, really. That's me.
So for those landlords out there who are unaware of ARLA, there's a little in-joke that more people think it's milk than a regulatory body. Who are ARLA, what do they do, and why are they important to me and you?
Well, I don't work for the dairy ARLA. That's the first place to start. So ARLA are the main sort of leading body of qualifications for the private rental sector or the property sector in general. So we obviously look after members which have to adhere to a certain code of conduct, which is obviously important ethically, but also we support through to government. So when government are talking through changes, they will work alongside working groups within the fellow executives to feed in from our area. So it's sort of a twofold thing. So we work with government, but we also work with our members. So it's just about making sure everybody's working to the same kind of ethics, really, I guess.
Okay. So moving on, Tristan's list of questions.
Yes.
Time to get grilled.
I've got a number of questions for you, and one of them was briefly covered by Mike there, so I'll skip that one in terms of who you are. But more importantly, from a landlord point of view, obviously speaking to agents, there's a lot of let-only landlords that do it themselves, but what's important to a landlord when choosing an agent, and what questions should they be asking when obviously appointing them, and what should they be looking out for?
It's a really good question, and I think it really is very personal to that landlord. I think for me, the first thing I think they need to work out is what is most important to them. So, if money is a factor, then there is models that are geared up to just an advertisement. And likewise, if you are not worried about money, there are the full Rolls Royce of services. So I think when picking an agent, you need to make sure that it works alongside your values and budget. So I think I hate to say that fee's important. I think if it's important to you, it will remain important. If in terms of picking an agent, for me, it's about trust. When you can sit in front of people, you get a gauge for somebody pretty quick. If you trust them, it doesn't really matter what's their logo, where they're from and how long they've been operating. If you trust them and you believe in what they're talking about, that for me is probably the fundamentals. I think there are lots of different agents working under different badges that all have different strengths, and you just need to work out what you like about them, really, I think. Is that fair?
Absolutely, yeah, I totally agree. The main word is trust.
Yeah.
What it always comes down to with me is you're handing over the keys to your asset. 300, 400, 500,000 pounds in some cases, and you've got to trust that person that when they make a judgment call on your behalf, they're working in your best interest.
It's a long-term relationship though, and I've found that a lot of my business is done off referrals.
Yeah.
So by providing that service to them is only going to gain more business in the future, and potentially they grow their portfolio. So massively trust him in my opinion as well. So I have to agree with you on that.
I think people buy into people, and it doesn't matter. We've all probably got different histories in terms of who we work for, but consistently our clients come with us because they trust us as individuals, not necessarily what colour our hoodies are, or our badges are.
Yeah. So that brings me on to my next question then. So obviously there's been a lot of changes in legislation in my time in agency.
Yeah.
And more so, there's been changes during the COVID period, obviously with evictions, notices and so forth, and then the talks of EPC changes, and there's just ever-growing changes in legislation. But in the last 12 months, given a small overview, what's changed to landlords and what do they need to be aware of?
It's fun, isn't it, keeping up with all the legislation? It is really fun. I think probably the biggest change that's going to last is the mandatory electrical safety testing. So they brought that in, they started bringing it in last year with new tenancies, and then existing tenancies had to comply by April this year. I think that was a big change. For me, I can't believe it took that long to get it in, to be honest. More fires were caused by electrics than gas, problems. Just look at Grenville, that was dodgy electrics that started that all off. So I think for me, it was about time it kind of came in. I think, as you've pointed out, having all the changes to the evictions has been probably the biggest boggle of the year. Is, okay, what do I do now if I want to sell my property, etc. The good news is from the 1st of October, things are back to kind of pre-COVID for the time being. And then we look at the next 12 months and then we'll see what happens, I guess. But yeah, I think electrics for me is probably the biggest change that's existing that's in.
Perfect. And then going on to, obviously I understand you may not be able to share too much information and it's all government led mainly, but in regards to the next 12 months, do we have any potential new legislation that landlords might want to start preparing for? Is there anything you can share on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the next 12 months, it's difficult to pinpoint if it will definitely be in the next 12 months, because as with everything, it changes, the goals change. But I think in terms of moving forward, the next phase of things will be, as you kind of touched on, the EPC regulations. So that's currently in Parliament being discussed. We had a working group on that with ARLA, and we all just said an EPC rating C is way too high and it will just wipe out a good probably 50% when we looked at it of stock. There's also a huge cost implication for landlords, which has then a further knock-on effect about why people, come into the industry. I watched your landlord update about, I think it was 5% of transactions at the moment are through investors. And that's really interesting because that's very low at the moment. And I do wonder if a lot of that has come in from the cost implications of being a landlord. So my concern is if they raise it to a C, you're just going to wipe out so many, even new builds, in parts. So what we have proposed from our side of things is a D rating that sits somewhere in the middle, and it's a lot more achievable for a landlord to get to. I'm
glad you covered that regarding the EPC really. I actually, believe it or not, done a blog a couple of weeks ago just with regards to the ratings, and I think D's are a fair standard to go to. A majority of properties are below that level already, and based upon the research, they say it's just under £10,000 in order to bring it up to that standard, which is quite a substantial amount to bring it up to that. In my personal opinion, on top of all the other changes that's come into effect, like the EICR, regardless of circumstances, they're required to get that done, which is obviously a cost element on top. Most landlords would have had it already in place just for their own peace of mind and knowing the legislation was coming in, but not everyone was in the financial position to do that. So it is a lot to take on board. Yes, it's better to bring the rating up as well. In my personal opinion, I don't know if you want to add to anything that's not.
Yeah, I think to put it in context, a rating C is above the national average for any property across all property stock in the UK. So they're asking landlords to bring their property above the average standard, which I've got no problem with providing high standards of accommodation. I actively encourage it, but if you're also asking a landlord of a Victorian house to bring a property up to a grade C, it's going to be very, very difficult to even achieve it, let alone want to do it, because there's only certain things, houses that were built 120, 130 years ago can be upgraded to. So whilst it's a good thing to aspire to, I don't think in practice it, from my personal opinion as well, in practice I don't think it's something that people will be able to achieve, even if they wanted to, even if they had the money to put behind it.
I think it's a process as well, because then you've got to look at, which is something they're also talking about, by a certain date that any sale property would have to be to a certain standard, and any home occupied by a homeowner would also have to be brought up to a certain standard. But how would they enforce that? It would have to be a well thought out process for that to happen, because there's going to be lots of properties being sold and lots of investors buying them, and it's going to add to affect the price if there's going to be lots of costs having to be spent on that.
And I think that's worth now with investors when they're looking at the moment with that potential legislation coming in. It's worth bearing in mind when you are looking to try and aim for something that's probably a D rating, because I think otherwise you could fall into that trap of being stuck with a property that you then have to invest a substantial amount of money into. So I think it's probably a good tip for all the landlords looking out there for that,
advice,
to make sure that you're aiming high, and that helps as well. We've got some great modern developments going up, certainly around the areas that we all work in here, that might be a good place to start. I think it's worth touching on as well. We've got the Renters Reform Bill being discussed in Parliament too. So that's going to be a huge change to our industry if that is successful or going through in the way that we feel it might happen. And that would abolish our Section 21 notice, which for those sort of non-agents is our basic notice that we can serve with no reason. Now, there's lots of reasons why people are concerned about that's to go. And I think for me, we've already been there back in the 80s when we didn't have assured short-hold tenancies, and what happened is that people left their properties empty rather than put tenants in because they couldn't get them back. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye out, and there are lots of different ways that you can put your opinions across to government. If you go through the Propertymark website, there's often links on there so you can put your feelings, and those will get back to the working groups. So if you feel passionately about something, you really need to let us know too, so we can help.
I think that's a good tip, and I think that'll be something that we'll probably include in the link as well in the podcast for people to find that information, because at the end of the day, if you're a landlord or looking to invest, your thoughts should be heard on that. So I think that's a great bit of feedback on that. I suppose my other question to you really is, do you think a rent cap will be implemented here in the UK in the near future? What's your sort of feedback on that?
It's difficult to know really. We have a running joke within the ARLA community that everything that starts in Scotland ends up in England. We're just always a couple of years behind. So based on the trend, I want to say yes. I'm optimistic that isn't the case, because as we know, things fluctuate so much depending on market. And again, the more restrictions we're putting in place for these landlords, the less people are going to invest, and that 5% will become 2%, and that is a concern, I think, for certainly us as letting agents, that we don't want to be in a position where we can't help people. I think one of your stats was something like 40% of rents, increase of desire to move 41%, which when I saw that stat, I thought, do you know what, that doesn't actually surprise me. For every house you're getting 4 applications on at the moment. So I think if we start capping the rent, we then start going into really dangerous territory alongside everything else that we've kind of covered.
It would just make the housing issue even worse, in my opinion. It's going to reduce the stock, which is obviously causing rents to spike as it is, which is pushing yields up, which is great from an investment point of view. But if the properties continue to sell and less properties are coming onto the market, it's only going to continue to creep prices up and make it less people move, essentially, because there's not going to be the right properties coming up. So personally, I don't think it's a great idea. And once again, people, I'm guessing, can share their views via Propertymark.
Yeah, I mean, if you engage, I don't know how far you guys cover, but if anyone engages with their local exec, so I cover pretty much the patch you guys cover at this point. So any of your colleagues, members, whatever, they can feed it back through to me, and I can get it to the right place if it's not an already set up survey. That's what we're here for. That's my job.
Perfect. And then the last question I've got for you really is, obviously legislation is always changing, as we discussed off air prior. And there's a lot of landlords out there that do rent properties themselves. They don't use an agent, which unfortunately it does happen. There's a lot of legislation changes that I've found over the years where they haven't been compliant with certain things. And there's a lot of property agents that have used agencies but then gone on to their own let-only portfolio and have not complied with all the changes. What's the best advice you can give to these landlords, and how can they make sure they are up to date moving forward?
So I think it depends. You've kind of got 2 folds of let-onlys, as you kind of pointed out. So you've got the ones that use agents. Now, I like to think that even the let-only portfolios are fed information from their agents. I think that's another good point for using an agent, even if it is just for a let-only. They will let you know of changes. If you choose not to, you can sit webinars and seminars with landlord-specific training to make sure that you're getting all the up-to-date legislation. There's tons of different ones out there. So I would definitely recommend sitting those. Normally, I know certainly Reading Borough Council do them. They do landlord evenings where you can go and learn about the new changes, electrics. They'll talk through, up-to-dates on housing benefits and things like that. So those are really great free events that you can go to. So I'm optimistic that other councils do them as well, but I can't be sure. But certainly Reading does. So I definitely recommend doing that. I think knowing what you need to know is so important, because what us as agents are doing is not trying to make your life more difficult. We're actually trying to stop you getting sued. We're trying to stop you being in a situation where you're worse off from this renting transaction. A big one that let-only landlords, I think, make mistakes of, less so legislation-wise, is never checking their properties. So, as agents, when we manage, we, inspect them, check them over and look after them. When it comes to let-only landlords, sometimes they just ignore them until they come available and then go, whoa, that is not looking great in there. Certainly in the Thames Valley, we have a huge limescale issue. So if you leave a shower screen unscaled for 12 months, you're replacing that. It's not being fixed. So things like that, I think, are really important. And the big one that a lot of let-only landlords don't realise is they need to register with the ICO for GDPR. So you need to register to be able to keep your tenants' data. And that is something that I think most fail on. So I would say those are my kind of 3 tips, I guess.
Brilliant. I think based on the ICO bit, I actually done a blog on that recently as well, because once again, the reason I've done that is because there's so many people out there that aren't aware of that.
Yeah.
And I think agencies in general need to maybe emphasise a bit more of the importance of doing so, because there are big fines involved for not complying.
Yeah.
And penalties, and same as the other legislation, like for example gas. If someone was to die because you didn't have a gas safety, it's not just a penalty, it's potentially manslaughter.
Absolutely.
So you need to look at the issues that can arise for not complying. So it's really, really important to make sure they're up to date on this. Check your local train, like you said. There's one in Reading, so that's great news to any landlord that's listening that's got a property in Berkshire.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there'll be others around. So any questions, obviously, feel free to get in touch with us. But we're now at the most important bit, or my personal favourite part of the podcast, where Mike's going to go through some quick fire questions for you. So
your
no
personal favourite is your hand over the
Hands over the reins, takes all the responsibility away.
No time to relax. So what we do at this point is you take your professional hat off and you put your personal hat back on and speak from the heart of what is your opinion on it. So no responsibility goes to ARLA Propertymark or your employer for the answers to these questions. But Megan, what happens next in the property market?
It's funny, when anyone asks me this in the office, I normally go, right, Mystic Meg, get the crystal ball out, give it a polish, see where I'm at. I actually flip back and forth between what I think is going to happen over the next 12 months. What we talked about off air was that all of us were surprised by the boom that we had after COVID. I think my gut feeling is that we have to have some sort of, not necessarily a full recession, but we have to have some sort of repercussion for everybody being off on furlough for a year. Furlough comes to end, I think,
end of September. Yeah.
And I think from there we'll start seeing some changes, in my opinion. I'll be honest, I thought we'd have seen the slow up already, but I think with the stamp duty tailing off towards the end of September, maybe October, we'll start seeing it. So my view is I can't see the prices maintaining this high at this point. But for everyone that you say that to, they say the complete opposite. So I really don't know. But
what do you
my
think
view
about
is,
rentals on the same subject?
I think rents will go up, mainly because there was a huge chunk of investment landlords that did sell their portfolios. A lot of accidental landlords, as we call them. For those who don't know, but people that didn't actually want to be a landlord, but maybe couldn't sell their property, a few years back and just let it as like a short-term solution. We certainly saw a huge uptake of them being sold. So I do think that there will continue to be less properties available. Again, with all the legislation that they've now got to pay for, it's harder and harder to be a landlord. And and the term landlord, we're treated in so many different ways. Some landlords just maybe got a little bit of an inheritance from their nan, and then you've got others that are like multi-millionaires. That's very two different kettle of fish there. So I think rentals will go up because there's going to be less stock available, but I think that the overall sales prices will come down. I hope that with that, then the investors will start to come back out again as prices trickle down.
That's the cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
The minute if prices get too high, and the investors will cash in, and then when they start to drop again, you see them re-enter the market. Exactly. You see them first in a very small flow, and then a massive flood. and then the whole thing starts over again 2 minutes later, and you're wondering what the problem was.
Yeah.
So it's a world that goes round and round.
It is.
Next question on the quick fire. If you were to invest in the perfect deal tomorrow, in the perfect property investment, what would it look like?
So I'm controversially, as a letting agent, I actually sold my portfolio. So I when they start bringing the renters reform bill, and I went, oh, okay, that's not for me. With time, I think that confidence will return. I think if I had £1 million, I absolutely would invest in some freehold property. I love Reading. I think Reading's got loads to offer. It doesn't necessarily do the most for your yield. From my colleagues from ARLA up north, they seem to get a lot better return. So I think for me, I'd probably invest in some terraces, maybe up north. Equally, I've got a lovely colleague, Sophie, who's down in Cornwall, and the holiday market down there is pretty booming. So I think if I had, £1 million to go and buy a nice little house in Wales or in St Ives, then that would probably be my go-to, because I think then I could holiday there, but also Airbnb it, I think probably is what I would do.
Airbnb is an interesting one. I saw a stat that there were 11,000 empty second homes that have been turned into Airbnbs in the last 6 months of this year, which says how people are now looking at property and how it should be used and making decisions on that, and specifically for the staycation market. I know 3 people in St Ives right now. It's only a tiny town. And it just blows my mind how many visitors they have.
It's beautiful. It's very beautiful.
It can only maintain that sort of level of popularity.
They do great bakery food, so
they do.
It's a dangerous place to be if you want to be healthy.
And a cracking crab shack.
Oh.
Last question. One thing, as a property professional, what's the best single piece of property advice you would offer someone?
So I'm going to go approach this as a lettings side of things, as a landlord. I think it's really important to think about property transactions as a business transaction, but don't forget that there are people involved. I think people go and buy cheap, they do cheap refurbs, they put cheap furniture in, and then they wonder why they're not attracting good quality tenants. What you put into a property is what you get out of a property. If you wouldn't live in that property, why would anyone else want to? So I think whilst it is a business transaction, first and foremost, would you live there? If you won't live there, why should somebody pay to live there? And I think keeping that approach means that you won't go and buy, a bit of a, dog end flat. You'll buy something that actually you're proud of and you'll present with pride, and that will run through with your tenants. So I do believe that good property attracts good tenants.
Yeah, I think it might sound controversial to landlords watching and listening, but a rental property, as a landlord, you're an accommodation provider and a service provider, because, as you say, quite rightly say, there's other people that are impacted on your decisions, and it's secondly that property is an investment, and that's something that if you keep that in your head, I can steadfast guarantee, I'll put my name to it, your tenants will stay longer, they'll be happier, and you'll build better relationships with them. So I couldn't agree more with that.
I've certainly found it previously, and you'll find that the first thing you get asked nowadays is who manages the property. And a lot of landlords I've spoken to recently have actually wanted to meet their tenants, even if we're managing it, and just doing like a video call or whatnot. I've had 2 in the past 2 weeks that have done that, so it's becoming more common, and I totally agree with that, definitely.
I think as well, considering like outside of what you think is a good tenant, in the last year we've seen that actually, yes, earning lots of money and being a city banker is great, but actually they're the ones who got put on furlough, whereas our workers in Tesco and our nurses and our doctors, they're the ones that kept our country alive in the last year. And I think taking that switch in your brain of thinking, I want professional tenants that are going up to London and doing this is great, but actually, look at the key workers, look at the people that are less likely, God forbid that we ever hit another lockdown, that are going to be paying your bills. And look at the fact they might have a pet, for example. I think that's quite a controversial one, pets, but personally I've seen tenants staying longer, like you said, with the pet because it's their family home. They've got their family pet, and it makes more of a long-term commitment as opposed to something short-term.
I'm glad you touched on pets, because that's something we didn't cover in this podcast, but obviously it's a very grey area still, I find, and there's lots of landlords as well, or some agents do disclose on their bullet on their points on the marketing, no pets allowed. But realistically they have to give valid reason to not accept a pet. I understand a flat with no garden, balcony or outdoor space, it's probably not fair on the pet, but can you give a bit more information on the pet?
So there was actually a big change this year to the government standard tenancy agreement, which caused a lot of confusion across pretty much everyone. Does that mean that we have to accept pets? So no one has to accept pets. It's still a choice. This isn't a sort of a discrimination sort of problem. But what the government tenancy was designed to do was it was almost like an opt-out rather than an opt-in. Now that doesn't follow suit at the moment with like the Propertymark tenancy agreement, for example. You have to opt in for pets on that front. I think pets will become not mandatory, but they will become with a greater weight soon. It's a constant discussion that we're having. I run a TikTok for sort of lettings questions, and I get so many questions about pets, and it's really apparent that I believe that pets really need to start being allowed in more properties. You've pointed out about flats, we've also got the freeholder to consider in that as well, and that's a massive factor. So flats you can pretty much kick out of the equation, but in a house I struggle to understand a reason why, with consideration or a higher rent, that you wouldn't be able to consider a pet, but still there's no legal kickback on that. If you don't want to, you don't have to, but consider why you don't want to. Meet the pet, get a reference for it, get a reference from a vet or a behaviourist, to know that they're not chewing up carpets or whatever. Because I've got a 3-year-old son and I've got a dog. Well, I've got 3 dogs, and I'm telling you, my child makes more mess than my dogs.
I think it's something to definitely take on board with that, and I think even with lockdown we've found more people have brought pets for comfort of COVID and obviously not being lonely and stuff like that. So we are seeing, especially across Berkshire, there's always been a growing rate of it, but there's been a massive percentage of people that have introduced a pet to their homes, and I think the only thing you're going to do is reduce the number of tenants that potentially come forward on that that could be that ideal tenant you're looking for. I've been in some properties that are absolutely spotless with pets, so it is a case by case, and you get a reference, and I think that's fair in my opinion.
I do.
Well, we'll leave it on the statement that my 6-year-old Labrador has never drawn on my wall, but my 3-year-old son has.
There you go. Well, look, we are absolutely, we're hitting facts today now, that children make more mess than dogs.
Absolutely. So, Megan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us on our podcast. Hope you've enjoyed your time.
Yeah, it's been lovely.
And hope it's been useful for everyone watching and listening. Contact details, as Tristan said, for Propertymark, and their information will be included on the post below. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
So Tristan, another podcast in the can. Great to meet Megan. What do you take away from that most?
I think there's a few key things to take out from that personally. I think what you put in is what you get out. Obviously, providing something to your tenant, and don't give something that you wouldn't live in yourself. I think that's important. I've always gone by that mentality myself, and I've always explained that to landlord. Although it's a business transaction, you want the business transaction to work for you. And I think it's important to do that, because you will find the best tenants on that basis personally. And going into detail with pets as well. Obviously, it's a big grey area at the moment. A lot of people don't know whether it is allowed, isn't allowed, and what the process of that. And she's confirmed it's not legislation to. You don't have to accept a pet, but you have to give valid reason. And based upon our conversations, our children probably create more mess than what pets do, so why wouldn't it be considered?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. In my case, alone, I think it's really interesting to hear it from her point of view, that a rental transaction, it's not black and white like a sale. It is something that will be an ongoing relationship with people, so it's something that should be really, really considered, that you're providing accommodation, you're providing a service, you're not just providing a square block of bricks that you're giving to someone for them to do with what they will. So there's definitely some give and take in it. And it's interesting to hear what's going on in the next 12 months. There's obviously the Renters Reform Bill going through. There's still a lot of talk and there's still a lot of mileage. So if there are opinions on that, if there is things that people want to happen, as she said, her door's still open for opinions, to take those surveys, to take those questions, so ARLA can try and guide that in the right direction for everyone, not just what the government thinks is the right thing to do.
But unless they hear from people, they won't be able to work it in people's favour. So it's important that if you do have an opinion, make sure you click on the link and share your information or thoughts, and hopefully we can try work it in everyone's favour.
I'm flicking through YouTube and through Spotify, I don't think there's a podcast or a video channel on YouTube that landlords could land on where they're not being sold something.
I mean, it'd be the first time any estate agents ever asked that question, but why not ask that question to a wider audience?
Estate agents have the knowledge there, but they don't seem to share it.
You can do different episodes based around someone that wants an exit plan or someone that's just starting their portfolio.
The rules change every year,
Yeah.
but why not just open the floor out and just say, well, is property even the best investment out there?
And tax advice is a big thing, especially with everything that's changed, capital gains tax, and obviously your stamp duty costs that you need to pay and whatnot. People don't realise what they need to prepare for.
We build a podcast and we build a YouTube channel, somewhere that landlords can go and they feel they're not being sold to, but they're just getting quality advice.